And we wanted to enter these questions broadly. So I'll read you what was written for the organizing statement. And it asks, who is the subject of feminism? What causes are worthy of feminist concern? We're joining scholars and activists who are working against the dominant model of single-issue feminism and the constraints of U.S. nationalism to bring the liberatory concerns of the struggle for Palestinian rights and freedoms to feminism and queer politics. Our roundtable combines the movement for justice in Palestine with feminist and queer movements in various ways, emphasizing the multi-sided nature of social movements, recounting and critically assessing the nexus Palestine feminism across spaces including grassroots organizations, marches and demonstrations, delegations, feminist institutions, and feminist and queer knowledge production. My name is Brooke Lober. I'm a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, and I wanted to kind of offer a couple comments, just thinking about the way that Palestine and feminism are being represented in popular movements right now. And I guess in thinking about this, I thought about the figure of Linda Sarsour. It was interesting to me to think about the way that she's been able to bring her Palestinian identity and interests in Palestine solidarity into feminisms broadly, in particular with her investment in women of color feminism. So it seemed to me important that Palestine, in a way, I think, has been able to surface through women of color feminism. And last year at the Women's March in 2017, Sarsour said, and she's repeated it many times, including recently, if you want to know if you're going the right way in the movement, follow women of color. And in 2017, she said, we know where to go, because when we fight for justice, we fight for it for all people. And more recently, she said the same statement, but then she followed it with, those closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And I guess it made me think about that proximity and how we can focus on people who are the most vulnerable or the most oppressed, and whether that's a feminist value. I wanted to contrast that and maybe bring to people's attention the contemporary phenomenon Zioness, which kind of tries to counter what they see as a split among progressives with a new kind of feminist Zionism. It's a 501c3 organization, a nonprofit, with a board of directors, and the founder, Amanda Berman, is also the director of legal affairs at the Lawfare Project, so really explicitly Zionist organization that's using law to shut down work on Palestine. And I'll let you all take a look at their website if you're interested, but one of the things about their progressivism is they've really dropped any concern about Palestinian people at all, and they don't bring up Palestine on their website. Instead, what they do mention are racism, misogyny, and LGBTQ plus phobia, and they say that they're working to end discrimination and injustice. So I just wanted to point toward that kind of use of progressive discourse and anti-oppression discourse for Zionism, but really at the expense of Palestinian visibility at all. So those are my initial provocations. With that, I want to open it up for our panelists. And I can introduce each person. I have really brief statements about each of you, or you can introduce yourselves. Okay. So I'm here with Maha Nassar, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Arizona School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies. And Dr. Nassar recently published a book, Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World. Here on my right is Diana Block, who is a longtime activist and a writer who currently works with California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and I think is maybe a founder of California Coalition for Women Prisoners as well. Kate Raphael, a writer and an activist, known in the Bay Area for decades of movement work, but in particular who has worked with Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism. And also, I listen to you often, so I wanted to say that you're a host of Women's Magazine on KPFA and a well-known feminist in the Bay Area. And here, Rabab Abdulhadi, who's the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program at San Francisco State, and a longtime activist, as well as published right in this nexus of feminisms and Palestine and well known as a transnational feminist author. So welcome each of you. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Well, maybe I'll grab it because I did want to reference historical, and I'll try and keep it brief. So I listening to the panel yesterday, or not the panel, the plenary, wonderful, fantastic session around the spirit of '68, which I myself was not quite involved in '68, although soon after that. But it made me really remember and think about the subject of internationalism, which was highlighted by several of the speakers broadly, not just about Palestine, but what are the mandates for academia and also the movement around internationalism. And I just want to point out, because I was involved back then, that the issue of internationalism has always been a subject of tension for the women's movement, or second wave feminism as it developed. And it has been interventions by various women, and then a lot by women of color, that really insisted that internationalism should be a part of any definition of feminism, although of course that mandate hasn't been listened to that well, or that thoroughly. So in the 70s, which was when I really became involved in the women's movement and also in anti-imperialist politics, there was really an effort that was, I can't say well received, but it was an effort, and it was somewhat received, to really bring women from other countries, the international struggles that we were involved in some ways, most notably Vietnamese women. And so there was an effort to bring the issue of Vietnamese women into the conversation about the Vietnam War, which I think was very important in terms of really highlighting and trying to make the connections between feminism and what that's supposed to mean, and the role that women were struggling and transforming themselves in that era. And I worked on a book about women of Vietnam, which unfortunately is no longer in print, but was a really very groundbreaking book in that respect. So fast forward to the 90s and the early 2000s, and I think the issues, always the issues of marginalized communities and people of color, women of color in this country also have been really a subject of contention. And how do you define feminism unless you include or in fact prioritize, as Linda Sarsour's comment references, the issues and the guidance and leadership of women of color. And I mention that because the California Coalition for Women Prisoners was founded in 1995, even though it's only more recently that the intersection between women and incarceration and imprisonment has really begun to be made in a very full way. But we started in 1995 and based upon the issue of really prioritizing the needs and the issues of women of color and what was happening in this country around the growth of mass incarceration. So only more recently have we then, and CCWP is the acronym, begun to really try and make more of the connections between women in prison and women's imprisonment in this country. And I'm going to note that when I say women, we do also work with transgender and non-conforming women in the women's prisons in California, but I won't say all the terms each time I speak. In 2016, I went on a really amazing, transformative delegation was Dr. Abdul Hadi Rabab to Palestine, where we really were focused on the issues of imprisonment, and was able to meet with many women who were either former prisoners themselves or had family members who were in prison. And that whole experience really emphasized for me the importance of making the connections between women's incarceration in the U.S. and in Palestine. And off of that, we developed a pamphlet that I only have a couple of copies of. It's no longer, but if you're interested, we can share it later. And well, yeah, if people start looking at it, then it's distracting, I think, sometimes. And then we also started a group within the California Coalition for Women Prisoners called Firestorm, which is trying to make connections around the issues of repression and the carceral nature of the U.S. program that extends to many other countries around the world. Israel, Palestine is one of the clearest examples, because those strategies of incarceration and repression have been developed over the last 70 years very much in conjunction and coordination. But we are trying to also broaden our view to understand issues of women's incarceration, indigenous women in Canada, people of Mexico, how that is coming down around women in Mexico, and a number of other places. So that is another intervention that we're trying to do to actually develop that type of relationship. Do I have, 2 more minutes? So because of course I forgot. So I did want to reference one of the things that was really, I think, an important intervention that relates to the women's marches of the past couple of years, and particularly the one of the past last year, where in a number of cities, the issue of Zionism and women became front and center, for at least in a certain way. And in LA, the organizers of the Women's March invited Scarlett Johansson, who has been a leading supporter of Zionist products and causes, and many groups pulled out. So that, unfortunately, was the resolution, because the march organizers would not disinvite Scarlett Johansson, even though they were given the opportunity to. So a number of women's groups and Palestinian groups pulled out. Fortunately, in the Bay Area, we had a better resolution. We were both representatives from CCWP and also the Arab Resource and Organizing Committee or Center were able to speak about the issues of women prisoners. And Lara Kaswani from Iraq was able to bring the issue of Ahed Tamimi, whom I don't know if most people probably know who she is, who at that time was in prison, and so we were able to make the connections very directly. And it was really, I think, an exciting moment when there was a whole contingent that featured posters for Ahed, and then having that reference from the stage was really just a very reaffirming of the types of connections that are possible. Although, of course, there was blowback and criticism from various Zionist papers about that, about the inclusion of specifically the Lara from Iraq. But that's an example of the types of solidarity that I think, and what do you? Yeah, okay, and we are having another panel that will go into some of these issues more. I'm sorry if I took more time than I thought I was going to, but come to the panel right after this and next door. So Thank you.
We can pass this around.
Okay.
This is just shows.
Martha, you want to go?
I'll go next. Actually, what I have to say, I think links nicely to Diana's comments as well. So, as Brooke mentioned in the introduction, my area of specialization, like more specifically, has to do with Palestinian citizens of Israel. So those Palestinians who remained within what became the State of Israel in 1948, most of whom were granted citizenship, but as is the case in a lot of citizenships in settler colonial states, it's of a second-class nature. So they don't have full equal rights to Jewish Israelis. And so my research has to do with the historical ways in which they connected to the Arab world in the 1950s and 60s, largely through the production, the circulation, and the sort of surreptitious, oftentimes, circulation of texts, poetry, newspapers, journals, things like that. So in my research, I talk a lot about figures like Mahmoud Darwish and Samiha Qasim, poets in particular, as well as other activists. Invariably, every single time I give a talk about my research, I'm asked, where are the women? Every single time, because in the 1950s and 60s, the public spaces that were available for Palestinians were already limited, and they were often limited to men. So it's very rare that we would see women in the public sphere in the 50s and 60s. Now that starts to change over the course of the 1970s with people like Siham Dawood and others who become more, have more prominence in the public realm and in the struggle for equal rights for Palestinians within the Green Line. And that process continues as we move into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up until today. And so what I wanted to talk about is another figure that is also very, I think, very important and very telling about the intersections that we're talking about, but may not be as well known as someone like Ahad Tamimi or Linda Sarsour. And her name is Darine Tatour. So Darine Tatour is a Palestinian, she's a citizen of Israel. She's from a village outside of Nazareth called Reina. And she is 36 years old. And up until about 3 years ago, no one had ever heard of her. I hadn't heard of her. Most people hadn't heard of her. She was sort of locally known as a poet and as a politically engaged and politically active poet. And over the course of 2015, there were a series of events, we shall call them, in which you had individual acts of resistance that were taking place on both sides of the Green Line. And there was talk of the possibility of another intifada rising up. So Darine Tatour wrote a poem that she published on her Facebook page and on YouTube. She recited it and uploaded it onto YouTube, called Resist My People, Resist Them, where she talks very explicitly about the need for collective action against the occupation. And for her, the occupation wasn't just about the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, but it also included the 1948 lines. And my reading of it is that that was what was particularly threatening to this state, that it wasn't just that she was opposed to the occupation in the 67 territories, which is quite common and sort of relatively widespread on the Israeli left and of course among Palestinians, but that she was referring to occupation as referencing all of Palestine. All of historic Palestine was being occupied, and that occupation must be resisted. And so in 2015, she was arrested in her home outside of Nazareth. In the middle of the night, the police came, arrested her, sort of very violently, very abruptly, and hauled her off for questioning. And she was held, and it was a very long ordeal, a 3-year ordeal, that involved incarceration, formal incarceration in prison. It involved periods of house arrest. It involved other periods of confinement. So for 3 years, from 2015 till about a week or two ago, she wasn't allowed to access the internet. She wasn't allowed to access her social media websites, none of it. And she was also very demonized in the Israeli press as a terrorist and a terrorist supporter and so forth. So her story garnered some level of international attention. I would argue not at the level that it deserved, and certainly not at the level of someone like Ahad Tamimi. And later on we can maybe talk about why that was. But it did gain some international attention, particularly among in social justice circles and Palestine activist circles, and in sort of artistic freedom circles. So PEN America and other PEN organizations called for her release and so forth. So to sort of bring us up to more recently, she was released about a month ago, a little over a month ago now. And last week she gave an interview in Haaretz, and it was the first time that she went sort of public, sort of internationally public, talking about another formative and traumatic event that happened to her in addition to her arrest and incarceration. And that happened to her as a child. And she talks in this interview about how between the ages of 7 and 12, she was repeatedly molested by a man in the neighborhood, in the area where she lived. And that at the time, she didn't know how to articulate or speak up against it. Eventually, for one period of time, she went completely silent. She didn't talk to anyone. No one really understood why, but no one really thought to sort of dig deeper. She describes how around the time she was 11 or 12 years old, she started learning karate. And that during one of these attacks, she hit her molester and shouted at him, which sort of scared him off. And the molestation stopped. A few years ago, she went and talked to a lawyer, an Israeli lawyer, to see if she could raise any sort of legal sort of justice, and was told there's no physical evidence, statute of limitations, forget about it, it's going to be more, it's not worth your time. And so she wrote a story that she posted on her Facebook page, a sort of allegorical story describing her experiences, and without naming her molester explicitly, gave enough detail that people in her neighborhood would know who she's referring to. And so she was asked by the interviewer, so she was interviewed in Haaretz, and so she was asked by a Jewish Israeli interviewer sort of what was your family's reaction and how do you see these two formative experiences interrelated. So I want to read a quote that she said in the course of the interview. She was asked by her interviewer, do you follow the hashtag #MeToo or the hashtag #WhyIDidn'tReport movements, and what do you feel about them? And so Darin Taltoud replies, quote, every day that I hear a woman talking about it, I'm very happy for her and for other women. I'm sure that there are a great many other women, and I know that it will take time until we reach the Arab women, but it will happen. My plan is to establish an NGO to address this issue, to tell them in Arabic, Ana Kaman, which is Arabic for me too. It's not a matter of Darin Taltoud, but of all the women. I didn't suffer for 3 years in order to stay silent. And here she's talking about the suffering in prison, right? So the suffering in prison has raised her profile that gives her the ability, the platform, to raise these other issues which would otherwise go unnoticed. So she says, I will fight against all the powers that want to impose means of silence on me. Occupation, men, family. What I saw in women and what I saw in prison and heard from women is terrible. Even so, and even though the solution is still very far off, I'm optimistic, because just as I started to talk and to break the silence and to not be afraid of anything, other women will do the same in the future. And so here I want to highlight and maybe use this as another note of discussion, the way that Darin Taltoud is situating Arab patriarchy and Israeli colonialism, and seeing them as mutually reinforcing and as ways in which they play off of each other to the detriment of Palestinian women. And so I think a lot of times there are attempts to sort of separate them out. And so we can draw on the principles of intersectionality in this case as well to show how we can, and I think Darin Taltoud is a good example of how we can fight these two things together, and how we need not downplay one to highlight the other, that both of them need to be talked about, both of them need to be discussed, both of them need to be named and shamed, and then both of them hopefully can also be eradicated. So I'll stop right there.
Well, as I listened to Brooke repeat the description of the workshop, I thought, oh, maybe I should, I feel a little bad that I'm not going to talk about pinkwashing and the, Zionist effort to control the spaces around queer liberation and the work that quit, which has existed since 2001, is the oldest queer Palestine solidarity organization in the world. Some of the work that we have done to counter that, but I'm not going to talk about that, but maybe in the discussion, if people want, we could. What I do want to talk about is the feminist anti-violence movement, specifically in the Bay Area where I live, as kind of a case study in the ways that Zionism can collide with feminism and offer some thoughts about how we counter that. So for many years I was a volunteer and then later a board member with San Francisco Women Against Rape, which is one of which Diana is a co-founder of. It's one of the oldest rape crisis centers in the country, and notably it's one of the few that's remained committed to a radical anti-patriarchy analysis and increasingly over the years centering anti-racism, while other rape crisis centers have moved towards a depoliticized carceral feminism. So in 2002, in the aftermath of 9/11, members of SF4 attended an Insight Women of Color Against Violence gathering at which Arab women were very much centered and their experience, and spoke at length about their experiences. And when they came back, wanting to strengthen their solidarity with Arab women as part of their mandate to serve the entire community, they embarked on a study of Zionism and colonialism and its impact on their work, and eventually took a position in opposition to Zionism as a form of racism. And some Jewish Zionist volunteers complained to press and to mainstream Jewish Zionist organizations, saying that they felt singled out, that they felt unwelcome, that they felt unsafe. And the Zionist organizations pounced on this and went to the city of San Francisco, led by the Jewish Community Relations Council, to try to defund SF4's services, which were heavily funded by the city as well as the state. This was a long fight, and ultimately they did not succeed. SF4 survived this assault with most of its funding intact, although there were significant ramifications and for the organization that took a long time to recover from. So flash forward to 2004, I'd been living in Palestine off and on for 3 years. I was arrested twice at demonstrations against the apartheid wall, the first time in the village of Budris, where my friend Iltizam was one of the main organizers of her community's successful effort to save their land. I was arrested the second time 1 year later in Berkeley at one of the very first demonstrations there. I ended up spending about 6 weeks in Israeli immigration prison, where all of my fellow inmates were foreign workers doing mostly domestic work or sex work or both, and about half of them, I would say, had been in some form or other trafficked, what we would call trafficked. Now, trafficking at that time wasn't nearly as prominent an issue as it is now. I didn't know that much about it, but I heard stories from these women, and I got the idea. While I was in jail, I was starting to work on a mystery novel set in Palestine, what became my first novel, Murder Under the Bridge, and I decided to incorporate some of these stories and have trafficking as a subplot, or as a sort of organizing theme of that novel, which of course was mostly about occupation, but also deals with this issue of trafficking in Israel. So when I got out of prison, I started to do a lot of research, and I learned that Israel was at that time one of the leading destinations in the world for trafficking, and specifically for trafficked women, for reasons that are just too complicated to go into here, but have to do with geography, with the fall of the former Soviet Union, but also the fact that during the 1990s and the Oslo period specifically, Israel had sharply limited the ability of West Bank Palestinians to work in Israel, and so they needed to replace cheap Palestinian labor with foreign labor. I also learned that the prison that I was held in, which is called Sarsour on the Egyptian border, had been built with U.S. State Department anti-trafficking money. The State Department had identified Israel as a tier 3 country. They had downgraded them, recognizing them basically as one of the countries in the world that was doing the least to fight trafficking, and had actually threatened to take away some of their funding from the U.S. government, which was so ironic to me, having worked for so many years unsuccessfully, to convince them to even possibly cut any amount of funding because of their use of white phosphorus and cluster bombs and other banned weapons. But we could never do that. But they did actually make this threat if they didn't do something about trafficking. So, but as part of the sort of carrot and stick approach that the U.S. government uses in its trafficking work, first they got an infusion of additional money, and they used it to hire more immigration police and to build a couple of new detention centers, one of them, this one so far, on the Egyptian border. They also, so 5 years later, Israel claimed to have effectively eliminated trafficking from outside its borders. Now, without going into whether or not this was an accurate claim, how they did this was, one, by deporting about 100,000 workers, many of whom, like the women that I was incarcerated with, had been in the country for many, many years, had children and boyfriends and husbands and all sorts of things. Also through a policy that an Israeli friend called "No More Visas for Blonde Ukrainians." And finally, by sealing the Egyptian border, by beefing up its border patrol and its militarization of the southern border and building more walls, and all of which was really done as part of the siege of Gaza, and to seal off Gaza from, in the aftermath of Hamas's victory in the elections, to seal off Gaza from, any being able to get any needed supplies and from anybody being able to get out. But it had the side benefit of sealing the primary entry point for unauthorized immigrants. So in San Francisco and the Bay Area, the Jewish Community Relations Council has by that time made itself extremely central to the anti-trafficking collaborative that was in the Bay Area that's working on trafficking problems, which are also rampant in our area as throughout the U.S. And they were, bringing the Israeli consul to speak at City Hall on the Israeli model on how to fight trafficking. They were taking police and public officials, DAs and stuff, on junkets to Israel to learn about how to fight trafficking. But at the same time, the collaborative's meetings were hosted at the JCRC offices. So essentially the JCRC, which had just a few years ago tried to defund SF4, was now controlling a coalition that SF4 and Mujeres Unidas and the Asian Women's Shelter should have been central to. And friends in that movement came to me saying, well, okay, how do we cope with this? Because, if we make a stand and say we're not going to work with them because they're Zionists, then, we open ourselves up again to a new series of attacks when we barely survived the last one. And some of these organizations are not that political and not necessarily willing to take a stand like that. So we kind of brainstormed, well, what else could you do besides taking a strictly BDS approach and saying, we support BDS and we will not work with you. And what we realized is that what really we needed to talk about was the entire framing, which comes from the US government as part of its imperialist project of trafficking as an issue of criminalization and individual rights and sort of increasing incarceration and militarization as the solution. That really what we needed to talk about was, for instance, Israel's role in militarizing the region, and specifically at this point its role in destabilizing Syria, which has increased massively the trafficking of Syrian women, and increased 40%, led to a 40% increase in forced marriage of Syrian girls. To talk about poverty as the driving force behind trafficking in the way that Kamala Pompidou has demonstrated that, she says if you want to do anti-trafficking work, you have to be doing anti-poverty work. And, Israel and its immiseration of Palestinians, its austerity measures meant to promote its, to pay for its military buildup within its borders, has actually exposed many women to the jeopardy of being trafficked by increasing poverty. And finally, to talk about just the link between colonialism, the demonstrated link between colonialism and trafficking and sexual violence, that colonialism always leads to trafficking and sexual violence, And so a colonial power, whether you're talking about the United States, which continues to have colonies, Puerto Rico and Guam and Samoa, you know, or you're talking about Israel, cannot be the source of the solution to a problem like trafficking. So that, you know, ultimately when we reject the neoliberal frame that views trafficking through this lens of criminality and individual rights and carceral solutions, then we can insist that it be seen as a manifestation of the nexus of patriarchy, inequality, and militarism, and eliminate the ability of imperialist governments, whether we're talking about Israel or the US, to control that work.
Hi, I'm a bit sick, so my voice. So my long time project is about looking at the narratives of Palestine studies, feminist studies, and colonial studies, and see how they work out in terms of gender and sexuality in Palestine. So that's the overall thing. So I have been looking and interviewing and researching these topics. Today, just because we have very, very short time, I wanted to actually just like speak about three different issues. One is how do we see history? How do we read history? Okay, and secondly is how do we read women? And three, who speaks for whom? And then finally, what feminism? Okay, and I'm going to do them very quickly. So, how to see history, and I'm going to put Lux for this. This evening at 6 p.m. from 6 to 7:45 at the American Studies Association, not too far from here, we are actually having a panel called Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Practice and the Indivisibility of Justice. And this is a project, so please come. There's many people who are speaking here, who are also speaking there. But Madonna Thunderhawk, Margot Okazaware, Mamira Prosper, who's a leading Haitian scholar who talks about the occupation of Palestine and Haiti, Shariana Ferrer from Puerto Rico, from Colectivo Feminista, Salim, Jaime, and myself will be on it as well. And we've been part of this project, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I wanted to mention it to bring up the question of how to read history. We started this project about two years ago, specifically because it was the 50th anniversary of the 67 occupation was coming up. But it was also the 70th anniversary of Nakba, and it was also the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, and so we wanted to actually really, one of the major purposes to shift the way people think about history, that not to focus only about 50 years of occupation, but to really be able to think about over 100 years of Palestinian colonization and resistance, and to rethink of the ways we look at the historical periods in which the Palestinian history is told is that this has happened here, this happened here, these were the Palestinians. So we wanted to either contest what does the Palestinians mean, and what does pro-Palestinian mean, or pro-Israel, which I don't use those terminology. I argue for justice and for Palestine, not being pro, because pro-Palestinian doesn't mean anything, given that there are multiple views of Palestinians, multiple interests, and so on. Within that, so that was one of the main issues, and I think we were able to kind of shift that discourse. I mean, people still continue talking about only 67, but now people are catching themselves and do the corrective that needs to happen. But in the process of looking at the 100 years, specifically around the 100 years of the Balfour Declaration, by which the British colonial powers basically promised Palestine, which is not theirs, to the Zionist movement, which is not theirs either, and to establish a colonial project in Palestine. What I've done was I was specifically looking at the ways in which diversities in Palestinians look. So I looked at a couple of things, and I'm not going to expand on them too much. One is about the whole question of who leads the Palestinians. So historically, it's always told that in the 1930s it was Sheikh Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. But there is always have been contestations, not only official consultations like Istiqlal Party, the Independence Party, which was made of sort of like feudal bourgeois leaders and so on, but also there was Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who actually constructed a guerrilla movement, which we could say later on could become the focal theory of Che Guevara, except nobody cites Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam. But he is very prominent in Palestinian history, and not only because Hamas calls its brigade the Qassam Brigade, or its missiles the Qassam missiles, but also Qassam is the name of the oldest son of Marwan Barghouti, the oldest, the longest, the most, not he's the longest, he's not the longest, but he is the most well-known Palestinian political prisoner, and he is the one who could actually become the Palestinian president if he's left out of prison and elections are run. Anyway, so his son is Qassam, and this actually talks about the place of something like this that gets deformed and distorted elsewhere. But the other aspect of it is that when we talk about diversity, it's actually really interesting to think about what was happening, because everybody then talks about the history, and it's all the history of men, okay? And men are cited all the time. And there is sort of like the intellectual amnesia, if I will, if we could use that word, is that basically drops the name, and the women actually were the first ones to organize against the Balfour Declaration. It was, and it's documented. And the women were actually very active in the 1936-39 revolt. And it wasn't just women too, it was also workers who were organizing as well. So it is not just our interest in highlighting the roles of marginalized communities, and we always want to talk about the people who are at the most oppressed and so on, but it's actually true in the history of Palestine. It is, and I'm sure in other histories as well, and I know some of them, I don't know all of them, but I don't want to make generalization, because I think public specificity is really important. But in the history of Palestine, actually this has been there. And it is there, it is not part of the sort of like the hegemonic, dominant history. So I think that's, so we have a lot of evidence about the roles in particular, and the militant roles, and also, in my research, I also want to also point out to not only the roles in the political, where the women come up and they organize petitions and they go have demonstrations and so on and so forth, but they also carried guns in the 1936-39 revolt. Also, when even to kind of like rethink about the ways in which we theorize, what do we mean when we talk about work? What do we mean when we talk about auxiliary support versus primary support? Who are the militants and who are the people? Which last night in the plenary, and I know that I didn't talk about as much, but Erica Huggins, and specifically Erica Huggins, was talking about the women who are playing the roles and so on. But it is not only hidden roles, and it's not kind of like just to out something and to kind of make a very liberal feminist statements, but it's really important for us to understand the dynamics of what constitutes then social change, what constitutes revolution, what constitutes transformation, right? So this is one of the things that. The second point is, so that's kind of like the whole of the history. I'm not going to go more into it, but we can have, I don't want to take more time than what's allotted to me. The second question is how to read women themselves. So, Maha, you mentioned Dareen, but you alluded to Ahad Tamimi, and so I want to talk about like three women who are, just because we don't have time to talk about all the phenomena, I want to talk about three women and how they get constructed. One is actually I'll talk about two, and I believe the third one, the Rasmiyat and the torture, sexual torture to the prisoner panel. But one is the way Ahad Tamimi, and I think it's a very interesting, because recently, the way Ahad Tamimi gets constructed is not only the way the Israeli Zionist press constructed as a fake. Her family is fake Palestinians because she's blonde and blue-eyed. I mean, you know, kind of like you cannot win for trying. Okay, so, but then people start like going into the discussion. Why is she? And then she is not. And we have all gradations, and we had colonialism, and all of this, and the discussion. But I think really at the bottom of it is the discussions of race. Discussions of race in Arab and Muslim communities, and the ways in which we get lifted in the Arab world out, and we would get called Middle East and North Africa, and then we're not part of Asia and we're not part of Africa, so we will actually become something, a separate space. And part of it has to do with the Cold War area studies, or kind of like it works really well to call middle of the East to something, or near of the East to some people, not in the people of the region. It's also another way to kind of situate Israel and legitimize it in the region. And it's kind of like lifting it from Asia and Africa is actually quite problematic, because then it makes the region not part of the third world. It becomes part of something else. So that in itself yeah. So, but that's part of, and then the whole question of race, which we can talk about at some other time. But that's very interesting to kind of think about, how does race operate? That if we are not actually starting from where the U.S. is, and the slavery, though, the slavery as an institution, that actually set up the whole settler colonial state. Not that was part phenomena that was happening all over the world and so on, but that actually was a very mainstay for the settler colonial state in the US. How do you think about that? But the other thing about Ahad Tamimi is the ways, and I think most interesting to me is the ways in which the Palestine Solidarity Movement and people who support Palestinians try to so hard to figure out how to construct Ahad Tamimi, how to market Ahad Tamimi and present Ahad Tamimi and represent Ahad Tamimi in a way that will be palatable to people. But it's very difficult because she slapped an Israeli soldier. I mean, she slapped an Israeli soldier. She actually went into the act of not non-violence resistance, actually violent resistance if you think of a slap. And so it is kind of like all these justifications about it and trying to think about, and I think that's actually one main issue that I believe it is, okay, I'm going to just say the conclusion about this particular point, is that it is futile. It's futile to always try to think about what does the mainstream think and who is the average Joe Schmo out there whom we're trying to convince, and what does it mean to make kind of like to the public, and who is the public, and what does it mean not preaching to the choir and so on. So I think it's also entails some organizational questions that I think we really have to, as exactly the same way we're pushing the discourse on history, on historical narratives, and how do we read history, we need to push this discourse too, and not just take things where they're at, but to actually keep pushing the envelope and challenging hegemony. The second question, the second example is Layla Khaled. I mean, Layla Khaled, and I wrote about that, about her, is in the ways that she gets constructed, both by the person who actually wrote her autobiography, George Hajjar, in which he describes her as childlike. Which is very interesting because also, what's her name, the woman who wrote the book about Rigoberta Menchú? Gray. She was the partner of also de Grey, who wrote the book about the Third World Revolutions and so on. Anyway, she wrote the book about Rigoberta Menchú, and she also describes Rigoberta Menchú as childlike. And so there is this kind of like, you can only sympathize with militants far away only if you construct them in a way that makes them non-threatening. And then the discussions about Layla Khaled in various writings, actually, in various writings that have been mentioned about her, is that she is kind of shocked that her group, the PFLP, actually went and hijacked a plane to liberate her because she was arrested, she was held in British jail, and her group went and hijacked the plane to release her. And so the way she read is that she is so shocked because she doesn't think as a woman she's worthy of being liberated. But actually, it's very interesting because if you read it against the Palestinian cultural background, in the sense that everybody, and I speak in Arabic, لَعَنَ اللَّهُ كَلِمَةَ أَنَا, nobody says I. We always say we, even if you did it yourself, you say we. Many Palestinian, when you speak to Palestinian former prisoners and leaders and militants and so on, they always say my experience is nothing. It's nothing compared to anybody. Nothing. It's nothing compared to anybody else because they are always emphasizing the collective, and they are raising a very important theoretical point that gets lost is the non-exceptionality of people participating in the struggle, the non-exceptionality of women, the non-exceptionality of all of these issues. So instead of seeing her as actually like trying to minimize, because she's a very big shot, she's a huge leader, and these interviews are made with her much later and so on. Instead of reading that, she is being read as somebody who is docile, as somebody kind of like reinforcing the gender hierarchy in the society. So I mean, we can talk more about that. The third point is who speaks for whom, and I'm really rushing. Who speaks for whom is who speaks for different groups, who speaks for, actually I'll talk about that last because I wanted to mention a little bit about the whole question, not of Zionists only, but to link up the Women's March with actually the International Women's Strike. Because the Women's Marches were dominant, mainstream, especially January 20th, 2017, were the Hillary marches. I think I'm okay with people who protested. I'm for all kinds of protests and for all levels of protest and for all depth or light or serious or whatever. I think I'm okay with that. And I don't have allergies on the pink pussy hats. It's all of it is fine. So I'm not actually making that statement. I want to take the International Women's Strike that was very different from the women's marches. That was something that actually made the Coalition International, that talked about the US and the international scene, that talked about labor, working, and they actually talked about work too. It's not just International Women's Day, we celebrate the day for women. It's International Women's Working Day. It came out of the Shirtwaist Triangle, where we were workers, were immigrant workers who were working together because they could not actually escape. I mean, this is some of the things that really, this is what the International Women's Strike did. And it also, one of their coordinators was Rasmiya Ode. And I think it was rightly so that Rasmiya Ode you should have somebody from Arab, Muslim, Palestinian community. And I think maybe you should have more, but they had one person. It's okay. So then we had this young Zionist, not very well-known person named Emily Shire, write an article in the New York Times saying, is there a space in feminism for Zionism? Lo and behold, everybody and their cousin picks up on this. And so it leads to Zionists, this organization that Amanda Bierman is not only the co-chair of the Lober Project, the group that has been suing me, and thank God we defeated them big time, so they really defeated. But she is also sits on the board of Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces. This is and the other people who are in it is her co-friend Brooke Goldstein, who has worked for Campus Watch and so on. They all have really, really horrible histories. But before we even get to Zionists, I want to talk a little bit about Emily Shire, because what Emily Shire raised in that, she raised something, is there a place for Zionism in feminism? And of course, we all say no, and we wrote about it and so on, but I think the point, so she raised 4 points that she thought they were problematic. One is that in order to make this issue about Zionism and feminism, one is that why are there Palestinians? Why Rasmiya Ode, the non-terrorist, blah, 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 was part of it. Then she raised the question of why is it that the International Women's Strike talked about stopping the borders from Palestine to Mexico. Then she said she trashed the young woman who at Columbia University used to carry her mattress around, and she was given refuge at the Office of Students for Justice in Palestine. That it is the Students for Justice in Palestine should actually stop somebody who has been sexually abused from having refuge. I mean, she was shocked at that. It's like, why would they do that? I mean, why wouldn't they, right? And then the biggest issue that she raised was really the question of, to me, in my view, is not these are separate issues, but she really raised to argue for that is single issue versus multiple issues. I think that was she was saying that there should be, we're all women, i.e. Vagina Inc., which I know, okay, and we are unified by womanhood. And so we are all the same wherever we are and so on. So which, I mean, we know it is essentialism. But she was arguing against the possibility of having multiple issues of struggling around. I mean, kind of like when people say, maybe every issue is women's issue. No, women's issue is everybody's issue, but all issues are not women's issues, right? I mean, this is kind of like its one direction, not the other. And it raises a question about social movements that have been raised for a very long time. What do you struggle around? And it raises a question for us here, and anybody who's kind of combining scholarship and activism and not just focusing on writing about things, but actually trying to change the world, is how do we deal with the question of multiple issues without actually it sounding like the critiques of some of the, I would say, the centrist forces in the movement for change, peace and justice movement, that they say a laundry list. Why you're bringing me a laundry list of things? How can I be working on 100,000 things at the same time? And I think that the framework that we're adopting, which we draw, of course, the inspiration from Martin Luther King, Justice is Indivisible, the indivisibility of justice, is that if we have that, if we think of justice for Palestine as part of the indivisibility of justice and linked with it, then it would be impossible for us to have any kind of justice issues without having this overall framework that incorporates colonialism, that incorporates imperialism, that incorporates incarceration. So you do not have to be listing 100,000 issues and so on, but the framework, always the approach is to questions of justice. And how do we, articulate that? So the last point is who speaks for who. I know, yeah, who speaks for? So I'm going to stop here, and then we can have a discussion.
Yeah, let's have a discussion, and I just want to say thank you to everyone, all the panelists. So we've had a little round of applause. And we have 15 minutes for questions, which another point to bring up, which is about who gets to speak and who speaks for whom, and it's been historically really important, right, in this nexus of feminisms and the representation of Palestine. So I'll throw that out, but people have questions, we can take a couple to start with, and comments. Yeah, please share.
Can you say your name, please?
Yes, I'm Priscilla Barker. I'm from the University of South Carolina. I just have a very mundane question. Where is the Teaching Palestine thing tonight? Because I really like to go.
It's at the Westin.
It's at the Westin.
The Westin Hotel.
We'll find it.
Yeah, it's at the American Studies Association meeting, so.
Do we have a
Right,
sign-up
but
sheet, by the way? Do we have a sign-up sheet?
No, but I think that's what.
I'll do it. I'll
Thank you, Sammy.
I'll get for you.
I just wanted to comment on something. I thought there's lots of profound things said by everyone here, but I thought that the indivisibility is really palatable, and I like the way of thinking of not being overwhelmed by it, but understanding that, you know, injustice anywhere means injustice everywhere, right? So that sort of indivisibility I thought was really important. But it also reminded me, my name is Kristen Bayer, I teach at Marist College in upstate New York, and I'm the director of the Women, Gender, and Sexual Studies program there. Very small. So I'm working hard to sort of spread it out across campus. And I teach Asian history. So resistance in China in particular is relevant to all of this as well. But instead, in talking about the we and non-exceptionality, I thought of Rosa Parks. And I thought it's really defanging of militants is something I hadn't thought about in a global sense until this minute. And I think it's probably an important thing to spend a little bit more time on in my own work, but also I'm interested in if this is something you're doing too, right? So Rosa Parks, up until recently, in the wider way of talking, was sort of a nice woman who, you know, always gentle. She's described as soft-spoken, all that, when actually that has nothing at all to do with her real history, right? So Jean Theo Harris just recently wrote a book, The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, or Mrs. Rosa Parks, you know, tracing her activism and anger, right? And there's new work out about accepting anger and understanding the use of anger in all of this. And so for me, I'm just wondering if people are finding that as a space by which to be more global in how we think about defanging militants in order to relate to them, as opposed to maybe grasping the militancy as a useful one.
But there's also, just on this contestation of the Rosa Parks thing, because there's a book written about
Your
the
name.
strategy. Sorry, Simona Schiavone, Marymount College. There was a single mother that was much more militant, that was younger. There was a discussion of who is going to be at that action. It was a planned strategy, and because of the image, they put for Rosa Parks because they thought people are going to be. So I think, yes,
Both
she
sides.
was
Those were both sides.
they were all activists, but they were deploying the message, and I think that goes to the Bab's point about Ahmed Tamimi, that marginalized groups have always thought about how to challenge the kind of the politics of representation, but in that reinforced, kind of placated to some extent to what society can stomach. I think in the resistance, in people yesterday in one of our sessions, everybody talked about women in black. Women in black was extremely homophobic, even though it was led, it is initial state in terms of not foregrounded, not letting women saying as a queer anti-occupation activist, even though it was known, but in the early, I'm talking 1888 to 92, and this was Hannah Safran wrote an MA thesis about it. There was like self-silencing because the movement wanted to make as much impact at that point in Israel.
So predicting the audience, like you said, wasting time predicting, right, the mainstream press's response.
So listening to all of this also sort of helps me think about how societies at large still have an inability to process women's anger.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're either demonized, like Darin Taltour was. Their anger is papered over, as is the case with Rosa Parks. And Ahmed Tamimi also, there's this attempt to try to say, well, she is part of the resistance. We don't want to talk too much about the fact that she slapped a soldier, but we want to talk more about how she represents this kind of larger Palestinian protest movement. And so
and also that her cousin is all like personal reasons.
Right. That it was
not the
her
bigger,
shot.
issue.
But the personal, so one can get anger. A woman can be angry out of sort of emotional, familial kinds of reasons. But to be angry over a situation of injustice, a situation of colonialism, a situation of occupation, that's deemed as being beyond the pale. And so that, I think, is when we think about framing and when we think about intersectionality, that's, I think, one of the avenues that we really need to work to deconstruct at all levels. So it's starting to happen right now in the case of Rosa Parks, but a lot more work needs to be done, I think.
I mean, it's also interesting because, you know, even with Razmia Ode also, I mean, I got really frustrated during that campaign sometimes because I would hear people talking about her as a grandmother and a community activist and like basically denying that she had been a militant. And I'm like, you know, what about the fact that she was a resistor, you know, resisting illegal occupation of her land, which is something that one has a right to do. And, you know, I understood why they were doing it. And at the same time, the US government was using as one of the reasons to imprison her that, like, not to let her out on bail, that she didn't have children. And, you know, so it was this whole, like, these respectability politics, the way that intervenes in our portrayals of women who are militants, you know, I think, and it never works out, like you say, I mean, it doesn't matter how sanitized you try to make people, it is not going to succeed, so we are better off speaking to our base.
I'm gonna
learning from the
I have to have a disagree a little bit or put it in a larger case context of criminalization. Because I don't think that it's only an issue around women. I mean, if you are dealing with, first of all, the issue of violence at all around for anybody, you in this context in the United States, you are always trying to, I mean, people who have violent histories, who are men, who are prisoners, people are trying to dial it down. And it has to do with many factors, and I am certainly not advocating that as a political strategy, but I also think you have to see the thing about Ahed and Razmia in terms, Razmia in particular, around the legal cases she was facing. So I think you're having to juggle a legal strategy and how you're trying to represent her so that she wouldn't get deported, but unfortunately she was still deported, with a political reality of who she was. And I'm not
but she
raising.
Still did get deported, right? Like
right,
but sometimes the
but
machinations
she
don't work.
didn't end up going to prison.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
right, there are other. Yeah.
I feel like I'm not really contesting the political point, but I feel like people who are dealing with those complex political trials, which, you know, I have been involved in many arenas, really have to balance it. So I think, but I do feel like, for sure, the issue of womanhood and who she was really a contested issue.
Well, I just want to clarify a couple of points. That I think that with Razmia, one of really the troubling ways in which the movement that was supporting her kept saying is that she did this Arab women organizing thing in Chicago because she was uplifting the women from their misogynist and so on. So it's kind of like, it is totally contrary to what Razmia thinks. I mean, this is not what she thinks, and this is the way it was really, and I agree with you, because also a lot of people are always asked to denounce violence in order for them, as a price for freedom and so on. But I am not only talking about, even the people who come and say, okay, this is how we're going to package it. I'm arguing that how is it those of us who actually know the analysis, and how is it that we can contest what's acceptable and what's not, and what is mainstream and what's not, and what's the public and what's not. So we, at least those of us who are doing the work, who are doing the theorizing and so on, are actually doing it right and not really speaking for somebody. At the end of their voices get completely drowned. I mean, what is Rasmiya going to do when everybody in her campaign says, this is better, this is better, this is, believe me, I know, because a lot of the times I've been asked not to talk about Zionism because it will work better for the case. And so there is this pressure always over imagining the audience out there, not as a challenge to push the envelope, but actually take them the same way with the media. This is what they want. We give people what they want. How do you know what they want? You construct something, this is what they want, and you market it accordingly. And I'm talking about social change. I'm talking about how do we do transformation? How do we do resistance work? I mean, how do we really challenge all of these things? So I understand all the various things that people can, experience, but I'm talking about us, that we have a responsibility to actually push the envelope there.
And I'm also not saying that you have to, confess to a crime, like that you have to say that you committed this particular act, but you can still talk about your real politics and, just sort of keep focused on the injustice and, the fact that.
I think we have a couple more comments. We only have a few more minutes, so maybe we can get a few comments in a row, and then if there's some response, we can make it.
Okay, I just have a question. And in cases of occupation, most of the time women are not arrested or imprisoned for what they did, but sometimes for what the men did. And I remember also pushing out the men, also as a punishment for both men and women. During Ijtiyah Beirut in the 80s, the majority of the Palestinians in Sudan were men. So is that
they were
part
evicted,
of
the ones that were evicted from Beirut?
evicted from Beirut and sent away? So in effect, is that happening to women there? They are being punished as a punishment for the men, and also emasculation of the men as a punishment for women?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. There is all of the stories. They're all men and women. I mean, what's his name? Isawi, Samir Isawi, his mother, his father, his sister, the whole family was arrested. A lot of the times they hold the family. It's, by the way, goes both ways, gender. It's not just like they need a woman, they will go and they will arrest all of the men, and if they need a man, they can arrest the whole family, hold them ransom, hostage, until the person who is actually wounded underground goes and releases themselves. So that.
But there are women who are arrested for what they do.
Yes.
I mean, and that was one of the things we were trying to highlight in the little pamphlet that's somewhere going around. I don't know who ended up with it, but yes. So yeah, I think there are definitely women who act like on a more developed level than Ahed. I mean, Ahed's slap was at least palatable in the sense that it's debatable. I mean, it's a little violent, but it's not violent, and so I think that
It's a slap.
It's a slap. That's right. The slap that was heard around the world. Anyway, but
I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'll say just in this ending conversation, maybe one of the things that we see is that by seeing how gender is deployed, right, in all these various situations, that gender isn't equivalent to women, and that feminism isn't equivalent to a concern for women, but maybe those tools that we have can help us think about. I guess I want to go back to a question of whether there is a feminist kind of value to centering or being concerned for the situation of the most oppressed and the most marginalized, right, populations, and to be able to be flexible, right, in addressing that. And maybe that brings us to, right, the kind of ethics of justice that we're thinking about here. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you all for the discussion.
and we are right next door. We could continue.